Good afternoon, everyone. I am Catherine Wallerstein, the Associate Director of the Davis Humanities Institute, and I welcome you to the last in our California Humanities funded Reframing Sacramento Conversation series, bringing together community advocates, humanities scholars, artists, and others to talk about the past, present, and future of Sacramento, with a particular focus on the creative communities, on the role of creative communities. The first two events, Reimagining Stories from the Gold Rush in March and Black Sacramento in April, are both available to view on our DHI website, dhi.ucdavis.edu, where you can also join our mailing list and be apprised of future events. I want to thank my collaborators at the French Consulate in San Francisco, Juliette Donadieu, who will be part of the panel tonight, opening the panel, and then Lucille Delbecchi operating behind the scenes, along with Julie Fry from California Humanities for helping put this panel together, Milman Harrison and Veronica Candle for their work on the series as a whole, and my colleagues at the DHI for all of their work behind the scenes, particularly Gina Nunes, Elliot Pollard, and our graduate students, Jonathan Radike and Avril Dietering. The history of the Sacramento area and the people is rich in heritage, culture, and tradition. This area was and still is the tribal land of the Nisenan people. Sacramento was a gathering place for many local tribes who have lived throughout the Central Valley and the foothills for generations and were the original stewards of this land. We would like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains Miwok peoples to the south of the American River, and we would also like to honor the Patwin Wintun people to the west of Sacramento, of the Sacramento River. We acknowledge that we are standing on the tribal land of Sacramento's indigenous people. This last event in our 2021 Sacramento series is especially focused on the arts and is different from our previous two events in that it brings together representatives from the project that initially inspired the series, the Oakland Saint-Denis Cooperation Project, which you'll hear about shortly, a project that has created a number of conversations and collaborations between artists, architects, scholars, urban planners, and city officials in order to share ideas and come up with creative plans for addressing urban issues of economic disparity, immigrant rights, gentrification, and much more common to both cities. It's a project that I've had the privilege of being a part of in various ways as both advisor and participant. This particular panel brings together members of that project and its creator, Juliette Donadieu, with people from Sacramento to talk quite specifically this time about the role of artists and the arts as interpreters, communicators, and interrogators of social issues, and crucially, as creators of what we might think of as third spaces where questions of difference, place, community, identity, and so on can all be interrogated. Places and people that at one and the same time should in some ways remain outside of social structures and institutions, and that they should remain flexible, free, and even liminal, but at the same time must be recognized as an essential part of the fabric of the city and should not only be well funded and supported in the better world we are working towards, but who should also be at the table with city officials, urban planners, and various members of the communities they represent. To discuss strategies for making this happen, I'm pleased to welcome our panelists. Juliette Donadieu is the cultural attaché for the French Cultural Services in San Francisco and is in charge of Villa San Francisco, whose purpose is to lead a future-driven dialogue between artists and communities. The Oakland Saint-Denis project is Juliette's brainchild, and she will be giving a quick overview of it in a minute. Cici Carpio is an Oakland-based artist, originally from the Philippines, who tells stories of immigration, ancestry, resistance, and resilience. Roberto Bedoya is the Cultural Affairs Manager for the City of Oakland. He is committed to expanding the definition of inclusion and belonging and has supported numerous art-based civic engagement projects. Roberto has participated in several of the Oakland Saint-Denis conversations. Chico Gonzalez is a Chicano educator, artist, poet, and a political and cultural organizer based in Sacramento. Chico was part of our first conversation, and we invited him back to this one to be part of this one, in part in order to bring the conversation full circle and to connect some of the threads of previous discussions. Megan Van Voorhis is the Cultural and Creative Economy Manager for the City of Sacramento. She came to Sacramento relatively recently after being the president and CEO of Arts Cleveland. And last but not least, our moderator, Joaquin Alvarado, is the co-founder of Studio to Be, working to support BIPOC producers and journalists producing essential stories for diverse communities and leading platforms. In addition to being from Oakland, where Studio to Be is based, he has built a number of collaborations and partnerships with allies in France. And I meant to ask you all to raise your hand as I was introducing you, but people will figure out who's who. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Juliette first, who's going to show a little clip, a film clip, and talk a bit about the Oakland Saint-Denis program.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, and everyone to be here tonight. And I'm really happy, to enlarge the discussion from Oakland Saint-Denis with Sacramento. And yes, I think we started this project 18 months ago with this conviction that we really need to learn from each other. It's learning from each other from different cultures, from French culture and Californian one, but also from different practices. And that's how the project started, and with this conviction that to think about the future of our cities, we really need to invite around the table the artists, the arts communities, along with the cities and local authorities, along with architects and urbanists, along with universities. And we put together so many different partners, and I have to thank, we can see on screen, Judy Freich from California Humanities, who has been there from the beginning. And what we did all together is to have lots of conversation about the different experimentation that have been developed here in California, in Oakland, and there in Saint-Denis. We did some, a short film documentary. We will see like really 2 minutes, but you can have it on the website, like a longer one of 40 minutes, and a publication which is available on the website too. And I think the idea is now to really enlarge the conversation with other cities, with more and more communities, and really share, I think, the conviction that we need to have the artists around the table when we think about how can we, make sure that our cities are, inclusive, creative, and whatever they are, in Europe or here in the US. And yes, we are coming from very different history. We are very different cultures, but we are facing the same challenges. We're talking about displacement. We are talking about inequalities. We are talking about gentrification. And I think we really need to join forces and experiment things that we haven't done in Europe and in France, and maybe something that you haven't done here. So I'm really, really happy just to have all the speakers around the table and to learn one more time from them. So thank you. And maybe Lucille, if you can share the 2 minutes video.
Je suis là depuis 2 ans et j'arrive de Seine-Saint-Denis. Et tout de suite, quand on veut rencontrer des artistes, on nous dit les artistes sont plus à San Francisco, ils sont à Oakland.
To me, both Oakland and Saint-Denis are cities that are incredibly diverse. They have populations from all over the world. We came together to exchange stories. These two cities are going through very similar things, maybe at slightly different times. One very simple thing that obviously both places are going through is gentrification.
What it means to be an artist in the Bay Area is that in a way you're sometimes feeling you're endangered species because the cost of living is so high.
Similar to Saint-Denis, there's a lot of industrial spaces, warehouse spaces.
Finalement, dans les deux cas, y a un enjeu de maîtriser le foncier, maîtriser la durabilité du bâti.
On vient du 9-3, on vient d'Oakland. On a envie de le revendiquer et on a aussi envie de montrer une autre facette de cette ville qu'on vit au quotidien. Le point de départ, c'est une conviction que faire la ville est un acte culturel. On se rend compte qu'il y a énormément de solutions qui existent.
The moment we reflect with another city, it takes us out of our bubble and makes us think, oh, this is a global thing.
Awesome. And Juliette, thank you for that. It's a good setup, and we're going to come back around to some of the texture of the relationship that has evolved between Saint-Denis and Oakland. But I actually want to start with our members of the community here who are in Sacramento to kind of help ground us a little bit and get your reaction. But first, I want to start with you, Chico. Your backdrop is a clear demonstration that art, politics, place, people are always connected, right? Especially for Chicanos, which I consider myself. And that image, that iconic image from the farmworker strike, which belongs to both Filipino Americans and Chicanos, right? Because they shared that strike. That feels like it's in my DNA at this point. So artists also encode certain values and questions that are impossible to walk away from. So I'd love just to get your take a bit in terms of the place, that dynamic between the artists and how a city evolves and what it delivers for all of its people. How do you fit in with that? How does your work connect to that? And what do you see happening in Sacramento?
So first of all, I want to say that, thank you for inviting me to this panel today. And I come from the Chicano movement and its legacy. Here in Sacramento, we have a strong Chicano presence when it comes to Chicanos and art in the public sphere. I belong to the Royal Chicano Air Force that has a long legacy here in Sacramento since the 1960s. The Royal Chicano Air Force was started by Ricardo Favela, Jose Montoya, both of them passed away, and Esteban Villa. And I was Ricardo Favela's mentee while I was a student at Sac State. And Ricardo Favela told me that I should go to UC Davis and earn my MFA there with Malaquias Montoya. So, in terms of the legacy of the Chicano movement, I follow that tradition. Here in Sacramento, when we talk about spaces, art spaces, the first place that comes to mind is Southside Park, located on 8th and T, right in front of Iglesia de Guadalupe. It's a beautiful park. It's like an amphitheater, and it has murals painted by the Royal Chicano Air Force veteranos in the 1970s, early 1970s, and that's the heart of our community. Whenever there is a struggle happening, dealing with immigration, farm workers' rights, immigrants' rights, that's where we congregate. And from there, we have a rally, and from there we march either to the state capitol or we march to Cesar Chavez Park, which was named after Cesar Chavez by one of our majors, our only Chicano major in the town. So they have a special meaning. And if you look around Sacramento, you will see a lot of Chicano murals that have a purpose, that either they are there to move, to inspire communities into action. And that's the legacy that I'm coming from, and that's the work that I'm putting out to the community. We are very entrenched in the K-12 system, painting murals, doing workshops with students. So it's all about empowering the next generations, just like I was empowered by the veteranos.
Megan, I want to pull you in, and I'd love for you to just describe what your role is, but you also are coming from an iconic American city in Cleveland that has had many lives, right? So part of what I think Saint-Denis, Oakland sort of puts on the table is what life cycle are we in right now and where are the learnings? So I'd love a little bit of your background and what learnings you're bringing to the work in Sacramento. And let's start there.
Sure. Well, and I would agree. Thanks so much for including me on this great group of people. I'm so proud to be here. So yeah, just by way of me, I grew up in Flint, Michigan. And hopefully that will say something to all of you about the upbringing. I went to a predominantly Black high school. I experienced a lot of segregation, or I saw, or was a part of. So I had that experience. I'm very fond of the industrial city. I was quite fond of Cleveland in the same way, the grit, the personality of it, and the complexity of it. And so I spent 17 years serving the arts in Cleveland. I grew my career there. I mean, I like to say that. I think that Cleveland was just such a place where it was super welcoming. You could start. I knew I had an interest in wanting to serve the creative community. I'd grown up in a family with a brother who's a musician, and all of that. And so for me, you know, continuing to bolster that as a part, I experienced that as a young person in Flint, the asset that we had of our cultural center and how important it was in my development and shaped who I was. And so I, you know, carried that with me to Cleveland, and it really gave me a lot of opportunity to really like learn and grow. And I think, you know, the trajectory there really progressed. I mean, when I came to Cleveland to get my master's degree, it was, you know, a strong creative community that was really under-resourced and was struggling. I mean, Cleveland had various like iterations over time, like moving forward and then peeling back, and you know, all of that. And it's, you know, it's shaping its own future now. But we were able to get public funding passed and really elevate the value of the arts as a part of that, and then shift in actually looking at helping people understand the role that arts plays in shaping communities and lives. We did a lot of work on neighborhood development. I had a lot of interest, actually, about a decade of work looking at arts and health, arts and mental health, arts and public health. And so, you know, lots of discussion of looking at that, like what does social isolation, how does that impact public health outcomes, and et cetera, and what is the role of the arts in really trying to move those things. So I bring that with me to Sacramento at this sort of stage to understand now what's an exciting and also complex community, creative community that I know will take me time. I had 17 years in Cleveland, so I'm under no sort of false impressions of what it's going to take here. But now my job is to do working inside of government, not as an advocate or a service provider, but inside of government to help contribute to the vitality of the creative community here.
And as, I mean, you moved to Sacramento in the pandemic, right? So give us a reflection on how you came to know the city visually, like just the spaces, the public art as it exists now, and also how it's laid out as a community.
I will say, you know, I spent a lot of time learning bureaucracy. I'm not gonna lie. It was just really understanding who the players are. So, you know, I'll say that, you know, my depth and breadth in the creative community is still, that's something that needs to grow, and relationships need to be built. I feel like the first 8 months has been really great for me because I have spent a lot of time building relationships with folks in planning, building relationships with folks that are working on housing and homelessness and economic development and all of those things. I think that's the, you know, I understand. I think once I add those two, I'll be able to like pull the pieces together. So it has been challenging, and I will say, you know, on the creative community side of things, but, you know, I've had some good guides, and I'm humble about it. I recognize that there are people that I know. I recognize that I have blind spots too. And you know, I'm working to sort of come through that. But I do see, you know, when we talk about specific neighborhoods and gentrification and things that are happening, there's sort of landmark things that I've seen before in other cities, you know, where artists contribute, often get pushed out. So they're creating value that they're not able to capture for one reason or another, but that others are able to extract from them. And then they get moved on to another neighborhood. And I saw that in Cleveland, I saw it here. And so for me, that's something that, you know, if we want to have a creatively vital city, looking at that issue and what's driving that in terms of our policies and our practices becomes really important.
Yeah, Roberto, on that beat, I want to get your perspective. I mean, you have this job in Oakland, which is, and I'm going to shout out to Flint. We always felt like Flint was the other Oakland. We had a few of those in our pocket as Oaklanders. But you've been in the job and you've been a part of the Saint-Denis relationship as that's evolved, but at a very high level, how much is in the power of a city government, of its bureaucracy, to help artists negotiate and maintain that space, and also not just contribute to the value, but to actually hold on to some of the equity that they're generating?
It's a great question. Before I respond to that, I'm having an allergy attack, so my eyes are.
It's all good, brother.
Going wacky.
Yeah.
On me. So if I
vision is not physical.
If I start crying, it's not a sad story, but it's sort of how it rolls this time. I often think about Let me begin with a little bit of a story, a farm worker story. Uh, my mom knew Cesar Chavez back in the day when both of them worked for Fred Ross, who was a community organizer in Oakland, and they were trying to do, he ran an organization called California Service Organization. So my mom was just doing uh, voter registration down in the South Bay where I grew up. And Cesar was in San Jose where he was starting his career. And over the years, when he became involved with UFW, my mom would hear about him. But I only sort of, I bring that up to sort of say that my wiring is often about work that's linked to empowering communities and empowering talent. And I'm in this lucky position as a public servant, and I really understand what it means to work in government. And that's a whole nother mess. What it means, how do you move the dial? We did a cultural plan here when I got here called Belonging in Oakland. And in many ways, it becomes the North Star for our city. A couple of things I learned from it is that, Oakland has rich history of activism. And I love my activist community, and they're very, very wonderful witnesses to inequities and justice and demand that and fairness. So I was talking to the mayor one day about what I learned during the cultural plan, and she said, and I was telling them, we have a community of the clenched fist that's very activist, and then there's cats like me who's supposed to do the arm wrestling, and that with the developer or with some variety groups, and then at the end of the day, you're supposed to have the handshake. And she said, Roberto, you forgot something. And I said, what? The sucker punch. So that's the politician is always mindful where that sucker punch is. And when I talk to my artists, uh, I said, you might need to work on developing your muscle with the arm wrestling. That sometimes the putting forth the vision is great, but there's also another skill set. And as a one last thing about being a government person, I work in bureaucracies, and I was complaining about the paperwork and contracting, and my friend said to me, "Oh, I was complaining to a friend. It's not bureaucracy; it's burro occupancy. So you can't hit this mule or pull on it. It has its own sort of life."
Well, that life has a very direct impact, and especially in a place like Oakland, where it's not only intersectional, but sometimes the intersection you're on tells you a lot about what your possibilities are, what you're fighting for. CC, I want to just sort of like this first lap here to come to you as an artist working in Oakland, but who has also this much larger frame than just the specific city. What does that mean right now? Also, the pandemic has not hit pause on this amazing pressure of development on the lives of artists in Oakland, and a lot of it's been driven because of all the arts activity. How is that negotiation for you? And then just for everybody, but to start with you, how much do you value, having an ability to develop relationships with other places, and which places?
I wanted to get started just by saying thank you for being part of this conversation, because I think all the topics that just been discussed already briefly is so relevant and important in thinking about how we are recovering from this pandemic. But what I've learned just within a couple of years, having gone through the pandemic and continuously creating here in Oakland, is that artists are essential. We are gatekeepers to contacts and ideas and hopes and vision, but also markers of time. I mean, we mark history not only like as a public artist doing kind of murals in different cities. It's not only just about beautifying a place, but actually telling the story of a place and its people. And I think that has been a tradition, definitely, that I learned from mural making here in the Bay Area, led by a lot of Chicano movement that I feel like I've been able to do in a lot of different places. And as far as your question in terms of how are artists navigating, I mean, I think depending on the artist, depending on the medium, artists have struggled through this time, but definitely haven't stopped the creation, and if anything, fired inspirations and thought of like, how do we envision how we recover from this? And what is that world that we are trying to create? And being here in Oakland, as Roberto had mentioned, you know, where there's such a strong legacy of movements and solidarity from all different cultural traditions, it's been inspiring to really think innovatively and creatively of how we as artists are kind of really marking this time and helping expanding and build awareness of what we're going through, but also what is needed, as well as what we envision. And even just that glimpse of hope of what we can collectively do together, I think allowed us to sustain and maintain and not only survive, but thrive through this moment. And I'm excited to actually see how we engage in public again as we are now reopening things, because I do believe that this past year have changed, and we transitioning on how we engage in public spaces and how we engage with each other. So I'm very excited to kind of like, I'm constantly looking out and kind of seeing what folks are doing and what folks are thinking and what the conversations are in terms of how we recover with this, with the lens of equity and with the lens of, you know, really trying to learn more about public engagement and how that is very much connected to how we as people connect with each other.
How do you know as an artist when that engagement's working? Like, what is the feedback loop that you experience when you can sort of take a moment and say, okay, I'm getting that communication happening in the community?
When there is the engagement, when people are, you know, I mean, I think a lot of the work that I've done this past year, yes, they are kind of like, some are semi-permanent on walls, but there also becomes an actual gathering place. Many of the work that I've created along with a lot of many different artists here in Oakland was kind of both a reflection and an engagement on the current things that are happening in the world. Last summer, with kind of the racial reckoning with Black Lives Matter, we turned Oakland downtown into an outdoor gallery, and the fact that people can gather over there and feel like it's a place, almost kind of this installation of altars where people can gather and heal, and people can gather and share stories and feel like, especially after like everyone has been isolated, feel like it's a place where folks can be together and acknowledge what's happening in our nation and really kind of analyze and strategize what we can do next or what we can do now so that we can create that future that we want to live in. And I think that is, for me, is definitely a big, huge sign of impact. I mean, a lot because of everything closing down and the limitation of being in public spaces. And now we have kind of like social medias helping engage and helping kind of connect to different places in different parts of the world. I mean, it was amazing to have conversations with folks in London, with folks in France, with folks in the Philippines, in Mexico, in Chile, and what's happening in Colombia. about what are some of those lessons that we share together and what are those struggles that we share together so that we can strategize. And I think a lot of those conversations I've had, just because of the realm of work I do, has been about cultural strategizing. And we've known from history, and myself with my short-lived life have experienced how it can be very powerful and how it can be very impactful, not only in changing how a place looks, but also how we as a community and how we collectively can move towards the change that we want to see.
Well, we got to transcribe all of that, Cece, because that just was like some serious knowledge drop right there. I want to remind folks that are in just listening in on this, please drop questions into the Q&A. I think you can use the chat function, but we definitely we'll start to just weave and integrate questions as we go along. There was something you said there, you used the word strategize. And you talked about the storytelling about the place, right? And Chico, you teach. Let's start at the end of the story. You teach what levels? How old are your students?
High school.
And do they think in this way? I mean, what are you teaching them? You're teaching them poetry. You're teaching them what?
Art and Spanish.
So do they feel like they are developing a strategy for how they want to live in Sacramento, how they want their art to live in Sacramento?
So one of the projects that I do with my students is we always look at social justice issues. So we create collages based on that, and they get to explore different issues happening here in Sacramento and also outside of Sacramento. I also lead the Chicano student movement, Mecha. And in Mecha, we're actually doing like hands-on work. In the last panel I was, and I always mention this organization called Cafe, clothing and food for everyone. What they're doing is they're feeding and providing like clothes for the homeless at Cesar Chavez Park. So with my students, we do like food and clothing drives, and we go to Cesar Chavez Park on Sundays, and we deliver that to the masses. So they're getting like some, it's funny the term, some real world learning, but we're doing that with the students, and they're conscious about what is happening, and how lucky they are to be able to stay home and access education through distance learning. We just came back in person, so that's another bonus. But just like Cece was saying, like nothing has changed because of the pandemic. We're still suffering the same social ills, and maybe even more now with all the racial tensions happening with BLM, with the anti-Asian hate or like anti-Asian hate. Right now, I'm making posters for that, and we're still congregating, we're still marching in the streets. Right now, the topic at hand is Palestine, and how Israel is taking over the land, and we're having an actual rally tomorrow. And in terms of being creative, I mean, I'm still making posters for political causes, and that hasn't stopped. I think I'm even making more now because of everything that is happening in the world today.
I was just testing my mic mute, guys, so we're good there. I through another project, I got to know some of the folks at the Mexican Consulate in Sacramento, and they actually serve, I think, from basically the whole 99, all the counties, right, come into Sacramento when they need to deal with things you do at a consulate. And so you might have somebody who's from Mexico City, one of the largest, most cosmopolitan places on planet Earth, or somebody who's from a small village in Michoacan, all in this same place in Sacramento. They arrived there. It's an incredible international city, Megan. It has, there's probably 1,500 years of history you could sort of peg to that still has a life in that place. How do you think about, addressing that level of complexity in terms of the stories that need space? That's first. And second, not everything can be negotiated at all times by one single project, right? So I want to sort of think about examples of public art projects or things that you, even if they're in a strategy mode right now, not yet real or on paper, how do you kind of articulate, not to compartmentalize, right, but to create discrete opportunities for artists to do a thing, not everything?
That's a huge question.
I know, that's like a PhD. Go ahead and get a PhD right now.
So one thing I'm cognizant of is history, and both my knowledge and my lack of knowledge. So despite having gone to a predominantly Black high school in Flint, you know, I later discover as I start to explore questions of race that there were big gaps in terms of my own knowledge and, you know, and looking at the history and the timeline. But I have a huge appreciation for history in terms of the work that we do and recognizing that and those assets. You know, when we started doing community development work, or we would call it, when we started doing this in, I would say, mid 2000s in Cleveland, we started looking at artists and neighborhood development and how we best support them. You know, we were working with organizers because we had a very robust network of community development corporations in Cleveland that had professionalized over time. But those CDCs were actually, they were formed by organizers who later did that work. And so, you know, it was all about this asset-based approach to development in the work that we're doing. So for me, the lens that I come at with this is sort of recognizing what are those assets and trying to understand the stories and the people and the place. And so that is, for me, I expect that journey of knowledge to take a long time. Like, I don't, you know, and to continue to do that while simultaneously reckoning with the fact that there's a sector here that feels that has been under-resourced, that has been divided, that really needs to be able to come together and to be supported and to be valued and appreciated for the contributions that it makes. So it is complex to be able to try to address those issues all at once and identify, you know how to proceed. You know, I'm just even right now starting with just race and how we've dealt with that as a division. How have we looked at the information that we've collected? How is that shaping our decisions? What rubrics are we using? How are those rubrics resulting in outcomes that would not be equitable? And can we do it better? So for me, examining that, understanding and talking to folks, I think that work has been very important for me to start with right out of the gate. How do we begin to look at that, and how do we create opportunities? I've had a couple of things come up right away. Monument policy. There's one. We've seen that happen in the last year. The idea of like, how are we looking at that, and what are we recognizing, and whose stories are we telling, and what do we even have? And beginning to look at that and say, do we even know what monuments exist in this city? Who's responsible for them and who we're honoring? And if we wanted to establish new policy and new ideas, what does that really look like? So I'm not sure that I'm answering your question. I live in a world where I am like, I jump from meeting to meeting to meeting and trying to identify opportunities. And all along the way, you know, my guideposts are, this is what the community said that it wanted. It wants arts education for its youth. It wants support and access and resources for artists. It wants housing, you know, and so each conversation I'm in, like I had a conversation just today about projects and how do we look at housing opportunities. I'm like, my goal is more affordable housing units for artists. Where is that going to come from? That means like what opportunities are on the plate now, what are the short-term, what are the long-term things? That's the reality. And that's just like kind of one slice of what I'm dealing with.
You definitely, we're going to give you the PhD for that answer. But it leads me to something which I want to do a slight pivot. And Jamie, thank you for breaking the ice on getting questions into the chat or Q&A. I visited Cleveland 5-6 years ago, and was surprised to walk onto a 4 acres of of grapes. And there's somebody who grows grapes in the middle of Cleveland. Fraser, I believe is his name. What's his name?
Mansfield Fraser, Chateau Huff. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. I mean, in that neighborhood, I know I mean, that was the Huff riot, you know, in the 1960s. It's huge.
So I met an amazing, really a genius who decided he wanted, maybe late 60s African-American man who decided to grow grapes in the middle of his community in Cleveland. And I just had this mind-blowing surprise, you know, just like I was caught off guard, and spent 2 hours there. We had some wine, and it's that kind of subversion of expectations that when there's something sort of crackling, it leads you down a path. I was in Paris on a project that we were doing between the Bay Area and the city of Paris with youth media. And we had brought a group of kids from the 19th to Oakland to work with a good friend of mine who's my partner at the studio now on a youth media hip hop record label that he used to run in downtown Oakland. And so they did like a week collaborating. And then we went to Paris, and our partner there took us to Saint-Denis. And I ended up at a farm that's like a social justice farm in Saint-Denis, and it totally blew my mind in the same way as Mansfield's grapes did. Roberto, I'm going to weave this in with Jamie's question. We've talked about the challenges of cities' bureaucracies, lessons from that experience, and not just negotiating bureaucracies at a metropolitan level, but how do you preserve the possibility of surprise, right? You talked about developers. Developers are not in the business of surprise. Money doesn't like surprises, but artists need them. Community members need them to refresh and reset. How do you do that in Oakland?
Let's see if I could earn my PhD. A couple of things come to mind. Ceci was talking about the murals downtown, and that was an element of surprise that just came up out of the hearts and minds of Oakland artists. And I think that sometimes government is my job in government, and sometimes my colleagues in government, our work is to get government out of the way. I wasn't telling those muralists all the protocols about permits and permissions. It was happening. And I talked to the city administrator and I said, you can't do this, man. You just can't do this. It's going to happen. And so some ways there's a way I'm lucky enough I can actually sort of imagine ways in which government gets out of the way. At the same time, there are two other things. I'm more concerned around governance than government. So what does the governance of a neighborhood look like? That the authority and the protocols that come out of a block are maybe much more real than what the policy world may imagine. So the governance may include a youth group, it may include the church, it may include an elder. So what are those social dynamics? So in some ways, to jump further ahead to the question of surprise and this whole language about placemaking, and in Oakland, creative placemaking, creative placekeeping, and now the new term, place snowing. At the essence of that, we live in capitalist America. Placemaking is many ways linked to capitalism. We're going to make money. So the other side of government is like placekeeping and place snowing is more grounded in how do we ground those practices in a human rights movement as opposed to a property rights movement. Those are the tensions that you kind of live in government. And, I'm not like, I never thought I'd be the man, but I'm the man.
It's all right. We need some people to be a man. But Cece, can you pick up on that for a second? Because I also want to sort of just reflect for a moment. And have you been involved with the Saint-Denis Oakland collaboration? Let me start there.
I actually just have had conversations with the folks leading the project, Juliet and also Julie. But beyond that, friends of some of the artists that had been chosen. So I'm familiar with the project, but this might actually be my first actual engagement with it.
You're jumping in. When you heard about it though, and again, if you were to take, if you were to get off the BART off the train and you ended up at the train station magically in Saint-Denis, you'd recognize parts of East Oakland there. And I think coming back the other way, somebody from Saint-Denis would recognize themselves a bit, even though a very different sort of, who's there, but there's something about how they're there. Are there other cities, like Oakland pegs to a lot of different places? Like for you and your work, what are those other places?
I mean, it's actually a lot of where working class communities, neighborhoods I see in so many places. Like I've painted in Atlanta, I've painted in Texas, painted in Sacramento, painted in Guatemala, I painted in Nepal, I painted in India. And I think this is my struggle and some of the challenge that I feel like I've seen is like, where's that sweet spot that we can make a place beautiful and have our people actually say in it? Because I do believe that we deserve to have a beautiful place. But as an artist, we kind of, we're gonna go and deck this place up. We're gonna make it, comfortable for the folks that are here, representing our folks. Then it becomes, as mentioned by Megan earlier, it becomes this kind of like place commodity that people want to go to now that it's pretty. And then the costs skyrocket. And we experienced that here in the Bay Area. I mean, throughout the time I've been here, and then we can no longer afford to be here. And I think that's kind of a struggle I've seen in so many different neighborhoods and different communities in which I've painted in and have been invited to paint in, is where, how do we balance that sweet spot where we can make a place beautiful and make it welcoming and folks can be invited, but where our folks are not displaced. And it's still kind of, it's still something I'm kind of, in conversation with a lot of different folks and people of figuring out that balance and also the acknowledgement of our people that we deserve to stay and how do we demand to stay. Because right now, I mean, there are some people who say that San Francisco is a lost cost. And I don't necessarily believe that's true. There's still so many people holding it down. Like, how do we actually preserve the cultures and traditions that have made a neighborhood what it is? And have the very people stay there. And I think that's the part in which I would love the conversation with governments and developers in terms of how do we create, because I'm not necessarily against development of things. I mean, that's how we create change, right? We create and produce and develop, and how do we have those development and those transitions and those changes benefit the folks who have been there for a long time. And this, I think right now we're talking about arts and culture, but I think in so many ways, this has been historically kind of how lands are occupied and colonized. And that we still see the remnants of those right now within the different struggles that Chico had mentioned earlier, has been the very, very foundations of some of the crises that we see that have created, civil wars and national and global wars that's happening. And in some ways, gentrification is just kind of a more smaller version of that.
Can we do a minor sidebar? You painted in Guatemala. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, Guatemala is such an amazing, beautiful place with such deep history. We partnered with the University of Guatemala City students and also the communities there with different ages, different languages, to be honest. And we pretty much became their visual translators of the stories that they wanted to see in the walls that they have provided for us. And they wanted to paint about what had happened in the 80s with a huge governmental massacre that's happened. And a lot of this are actual sons and daughters of folks who have disappeared, and they wanted to reappear that population and make sure that their existence is remembered. So we painted portraits of folks and pictures that they brought down along with what they're hoping and intending what they want the university to acknowledge, because in so many cases, just like gentrification and just like, I mean, and maybe this is a big, huge comparison, but just like genocide, we just want to remember, and we want to not only remember, but acknowledge that we're here and that we exist. So that was kind of one of the projects and one of the murals that we painted with the population in Guatemala.
I thank you for that. And it felt like it was important because in Oakland, I grew up in the 94601 zip code off of High Street. And there's a giant Hmong-speaking Mayan population from Guatemala that's moved into Oakland. And my sister's a social worker, works with that community. And it's remarkable to me to have sort of that language show up. I mean, I'm like third generation Chicano, right? Also in East Oakland, this is part of the transformation. I think you would see this in Saint-Denis also, like successive waves of immigration have continued to evolve what it is there, right? Like when I was a kid in the 70s, East 14th was like not that open anymore. And then when all the families came up from Michoacan, it suddenly started popping again, like businesses open. And it was not the same kind of experience. Like Cinco de Mayo, there were like cowboys, it was more caballero because that was their lives, that's what they were bringing to the party. So I just think it's ever evolving, right? And I think part of the complexity that I'd like for you guys to kind of reflect on is how much is there to learn from other cities around the world, even if it doesn't, most people in Oakland are not thinking Saint-Denis, right? But again, as you start to articulate it, as you start to create a channel for it, as you start to bring people back and forth, you can get there pretty quickly. So Chico, I just want to call out a city or two that you work with in your mind and your work that serves as that other sort of, not a mirror, but a refraction of the light that you're trying to bring into Sacramento.
So here in Sacramento, I belong to Soul Collective. Soul Collective is, we focus on culture, art, and activism. And the model has been replicated in sister cities around Northern California. There's Raíces Collective in Santa Rosa, El Comalito Collective in Vallejo, El Nopal in Stockton. So, as homies that came to the university here at Sac State, we hung out, we did a lot of like activism together. And once they went back to their communities, they opened a similar cultural center, that a Soul Collective. And I think that this is not the first time. In the 1960s and 70s, Centro Cultural de la Raza in San Diego, Self-Help Graphics in LA, Arte Américas in Fresno, La Raza Galería Posada in Sacramento, Galería La Raza in San Francisco, Macla. So, when we talk about like this type of collectives and working relationships, we had all that in our communities here in California, right? Like, CC belongs to a collective that two of my homies belong to too, Trust or Struggle. I have worked closely with Jesus and Melanie, Dignidad Rebelde in Oakland. So, like there is like similar-minded people empowering communities through art, culture, and activism. And we inspire each other many times. So that connection to Oakland is there. Like I was talking earlier about the Royal Chicano Air Force. Jose Montoya and Esteban Villa got their degrees at the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. And, they hooked up with friends from San Francisco, and they brought that vision here. And that's what we have it here. So it's something that we have dealt with. Sometimes the mainstream doesn't pay attention to what we're doing. And that's why we have developed this DIY, approach to things. But it'll be good if, government agencies support this artist without trying to change who they are and their mission.
We got another question. Jamie's like DJing our questions here. Thank you, Jamie. But coming from Kathy, previous conversations in the Oakland Saint-Denis series have focused on creative placemaking and translation. I'm going to throw the first one of this two-parter to you, Megan, second one to you, Roberto. So to Kathy, can you define creative placemaking and how it relates to the health of a city? This is your final exam question here.
My experience is that people make places. And so creative placemaking, and of course there's many definitions of this, right? But the creative placemaking is using creativity to unlock the potential of a place. That's the way I see it. Much of the work that we've done was really, I don't call the work as a service organization that I've done creative placemaking. I wasn't actively involved with that. I was interested in exploring creative intersections. Where does this meet this? And what arises out of what that happens. It's why public health issues, you know, like these are, when we talk about social determinants of health, is being these key things that we need to focus on. How does creativity contribute or advance or make contributions there? So for me, that's interesting. And the creative process then, you know, sort of emboldens and makes those places happen. Or makes
Can I
that
do
activity happen.
a quick follow-up? I mean, you work for the city, right? So technically you're a public servant. Are people in Sacramento voting? Are the arts driving voters in a meaningful way in Sacramento?
I definitely see organizing activity happening. I also note that I think the field is fractured in some ways from each other, and a lot of that is on very many divides. I think that the creative community will really need to step up in strong ways if they want to be able to advance support. I mean, I serve in some ways as a translator. I don't know if anybody's really talked about this, but you know, I hear what is happening in other divisions and other departments and the way they're talking about things. And my job is to say, this is how the arts connect to that. And then to translate that back. So for example, maybe an organization doesn't see themselves as an accelerator, but I do. And I also see that the economic development organizations here are talking about accelerators. It's my job to say, hey, do you know this is a creative accelerator that's happening over here? This is, you know, and then help them see. So it's all of that is a work in progress. I hope I'm answering your questions. I can sometimes get lost.
Yeah. And I'm gonna, Roberto, you're really gonna go deep here because we got, so the question is, what is the role of artists as translator? But I want to bring the Mayans in Oakland to the front and center here. And I'll again, you guys will forgive me, but I grew up the son of a Chicana artist in East Oakland, and all of her iconography was indigenous generally, right? But like I said, we were second, third generation, right? So the Mayans are indigenous and they're coming up, they're speaking Hmong in their communities. Like they don't immediately identify with Mexicans or Chicanos, like they have their own identity. What's Oakland doing to surface and support Mayan artists? And then I'm going to come back to translator.
That's a good question. And where I go, they don't apply to me. So that's a problem. They may go to Peralta Hacienda to sort of figure out where they fit in the ecosystem. So in some ways, I will try to support the Peralta as it does its work. So in some ways, I need to be mindful of who are the best intermediaries that may be able to do that. So that's one way to answer your question. I'm very mindful of the fact that they are active. I'm also very, old school Chicano that I am. It's like, man, is there so many layers of Latino experience in the Bay, and I'm very mindful of it. But I kind of jump a little bit ahead about answering the question about creative placemaking because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. It was a term that many way came out of urban planners and urbanists, and it was really tied to a lot of thoughts around the built environment. And so the counter narrative for me and my work has been looking at arts-based civic engagement projects as a form of placemaking. So going back to that place, and then to talk about racism within the frame of placemaking, it's still a white spatial imaginary that people still think about place as the built environment and don't know that other people, other cultures just sort of have place, it's tied to relationships. So the counter narratives that are coming around about place keeping and place knowing are ways to counteract kind of the capital machine behind creative placemaking. And I would get asked to come to these conversations often, a national conversation about placemaking. And like, because I'm a Latino, and it's like, Bedoya, tell us why aren't Latinos involved? And I kind of like, I think about it and I said, part of the problem, it's changed somewhat, but part of the problem was at the beginning of this field, creative placemaking was dominated by architects and urban planners. And it really goes back to what I was saying, it's really linked to a property rights movement. And the racist legacy of America is like people of color are still seen as property. We'll just take over your house, Filipino neighborhood, like you know, Yerba Buena Center, and like all of a sudden you don't have any rights. So how do you assert the counter narrative of creative placemaking as a human rights movement? I want renters to have rights. Do they?
Let's just double click on the reference to Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, which was an urban redevelopment project that displaced what was a traditional multi-generational sort of Filipino neighborhood in San Francisco. It was actually very multiracial. My mom grew up just on the edge of South of Market back in the day. Again, CC, this is like super advanced, like your Nobel Prize question here, but so we've got, literally there's thousands of Mayans speaking a Hmong language that predates the Columbian conquest, right? For the Filipino experience in the United States, right? I mean, again, the imagery behind Chico goes back to the struggle they sort of initiated, right? Specifically around that strike. How far back does the artist have to account for, right? And when you need to kind of get space away from, like, how do you, not that you have to segregate these parts of your lives, but sometimes you have to go to the studio and just work, right? Like, how do you find that space? And is your studio in Oakland? Like, literally, like, how do you kind of create that part for yourself to engage in these activities?
Well, I just want to start with saying that I will speak from my own experience, because I think there's sometimes assumptions that artists are this homogenous group of people who believes and thinks the same way, and that Filipinos are a homogenous group of people that thinks and believes in the same way, which is definitely not true. But for myself, I think it is a fine balance between being an artist and having that kind of selfish moment to feel inspired and to actually create work, and to be a cultural worker, to be out in the communities and really providing service and listening to the needs and to the stories of what folks want. And it's not always easy. I think sometimes being an artist, there's assumptions that it's a free license to do whatever the heck we want. And me as an artist and me as a cultural worker, it's not necessarily the choice I intentionally made. Like, I wanted to create work that represent the folks and the people in the communities I'm part of, and hear our stories, because we don't, or we won't otherwise. And who's telling the stories? Who's telling our stories, right? For working class people of color, I mean, sometimes it's either stigmatized or romanticized. If we ourselves don't have our voice in it. So just in terms of balancing, I mean, I think for me, it's as challenging as it could be, is also what feeds me in ways that because of the long-term relationships I've been able to build with different communities that I'm part of, or maybe kind of part of in the Bay Area, because it's so diverse with so many just different type of niches and groupings that you can belong into. There's been, it wasn't like, oh, I'm gonna go and paint about your life, or your struggles. I mean, this is actually accumulated through years and years and decades of relationships, and solidarity, knowing that we have a common ground, and that knowing that we have a similar story that we're trying to share and that we're trying to say. And I happen to practice visual art, so that's what my contribution can be. But I think what Roberto already mentioned, I mean, it comes down to the relationship we build and the exchanges that we have, conversations like this, where we can actually talk about what's happening on the other side of France and what's happening right here in the Bay, here in Oakland, and finding that connection where no one attempted to before, you know, and it's, I would say and assume as someone who had a chance to experience what living in Oakland is and now is in Saint-Denis and actually seeing kind of the similarities, that's what's happening into those two different places, you know, and I think that's also what has allowed me to be able to visit different communities in different places is because we have that shared experience. It might look different, it might be of a different place, but we have a shared experience and a collective vision of the changes and essentially the goals, similar goals of what we're trying to achieve, which is kind of the recognition and the existence of all of our peoples, but also just the acknowledgement of our rights to be able to stay and to be here.
There's, oh, go ahead. Sorry. So Chico, I want, if you don't mind going on a little journey with us through the lives of one of your students, and I'm going to try to get to Amanda's question here through this, but these are not homogenous experiences. And one of the defining features, characteristics, sort of qualities when I was in Saint-Denis, which is a couple times over the years, was the second, third, almost fourth generation of immigrants, right? Most of whom had come from the former colonial sort of holdings of France. And so that agility, that adaptability, that you know, creativity that every immigrant has to bring to survival and to thriving in new places. Your students, Chico, do you have immigrants as amongst those students?
Yeah, I have a group of, so at the high school where I work at, we moved with the same students for 4 years. So we get in freshman year, graduate them senior year. So because I'm the Spanish speaker of my cohort or my grade level partners, I usually take all the Spanish speaking families. And right now I have 12 out of 25 are Spanish speakers, and 3 come from Chicano families that are not Spanish speakers. So like 2/3 of my class is Chicano Latino or Chicano, yes, Chicano.
And can you, without naming names, of course, can you tell us about one of those students who is the child of an immigrant family or is an immigrant themselves, and where are they from?
So I have students that are from their parents are from Guerrero, and they ended up in the Bay Area, and then they moved over here because they were priced out. They could no longer afford you know, to rent a spot in the Bay, so they ended up in Sacramento.
And so how would they define, and Amanda, you'll just go with me, how would they define creative placemaking? I mean, you're doing arts with them, right? Like, so this child of immigrants from Guerrero who got pushed out of the Bay and now is in Sacramento. So that's like a lot of people I know, like buying houses up there. How would they define creative placemaking, that student?
I don't know, creating a safe environment where they can, where their culture is counted and where they're not, you know, just another like name on the list. You know, here at the Met High School where I work at, you know, our students, we build like beautiful relationships with them and their families, right? So their families are I also work with their parents, and I guess for them is to have a place that values who they are, their culture, and where they can be themselves.
And Megan, I want to bring it back to you, and then Jamie again DJing here, which is awesome. You know, if you before the pandemic walked into the main library in Sacramento, the librarian Rivka might meet you if you're doing a project, and she would go through and talk to everybody who was there in person, like just knew their names, knew everything. Many of them were unhoused veterans, and for that community in Sacramento, the library is many things, including a safe space, a clean space, a well-lit place, and a place to read because they're readers, right? And so we have this like diversity of experiences. For the 12-year-old or 15 who's in Chico's class, what is the offering? Like, where are the arts activated from the city, right, in a way that is an on-ramp for that person to participate in this placekeeping also?
Well, a couple of things I want to share. One, I think that the idea of creative placemaking, creative placekeeping, place knowing, these things are all jargon in our field. Like, so I feel like it's inside baseball that we're all talking about. I mean, I remember in the early days, when we were doing this work, we started with artist-based community development because we saw that activity happening. Like that's where we started, our work. So I do think that it's sort of important to recognize that, because you're right, when you're talking about, Roberto, when you were bringing up like, who's creating the places for who? And what places are experiencing the transformation as a result of that? Do you know what I'm saying? So like, I think that that's a piece of the puzzle. So for us on youth, our focus has really been on investing, in organizations and in people. And I think, with our CARES funding, the relief funds that we saw, like I stepped right into that. Like the city had been doing that, and they, for the first time, had sort of opened up to individual artists and for-profit businesses. And I actually think that was an important strategic move, because most of the nonprofit arts and cultural organizations are historically white. And so when you think about that, begin to think about like, what are the vehicles where this activity is happening, and how can we make sure that we're supporting that work, and bolstering that. And we did some of that too with the Healthy Heart and Mind Collaborative, which is something that we did with SCOE, and it was focused on mental health with youth. So our activities are really designed to help support the people that are doing that work. And I think that our job is to evolve and make sure we understand where that activity is happening, and that the vehicles of investment that we're doing are making sure that we're lifting that up. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that sort of cord of accountability, right? So that they're not that far off from your class, Chico. We're going to go into, Jamie's also DJing in a question here, which I'll just read out loud so we have it. Chico and Megan talked about colleges, universities as contributors to some of these debates. What do you all recommend to UC Davis as it negotiates the rapid ongoing gentrification of Sacramento, to which it also is contributing? Or are universities inevitably gentrifiers themselves? How can they address and mitigate these effects? Can I just do a 2 cents? I'm going to put one chip on the table on behalf of UC Davis. I had the pleasure, just the honor of being an adjunct there in Chicano Studies many years ago, like 15 years ago. And it was a phenomenal program on the ground. And it had the students who were all the Chicano Studies majors, many of whom did not refer to themselves as Chicanos also. They called themselves Mexicanos. But it was their safe space. It was a place where they could write in what they were going to do after college. It was a place that was really dynamic, right? In terms of really creating true integration for those students, and I knew them for several years on that campus. So I do feel like, then this is just, I'm going to guitar solo if that's okay. Every university can play that role. And let's not leave out community colleges, which the California Humanities has a very strong program with community colleges that I get to be a part of. Fresno State in the 80s, when Radio Bilingüe starts up, it's like less than a third Latino students, right, in Fresno. Now it's almost 2/3. So you can get progress through the institutions. But let's just open this up. We're going to run out of time here, guys. But I'll start with you, Roberto, then we'll go to you, Cece, on this question of universities, colleges as institutions, and then Megan, and then you wrap it up. Chico, Roberto, the floor is yours.
I'm an undocumented egghead, so I love universities. I love reading. I love scholarship. I love arguments. Megan's comment about the rhetoric are associated with placemaking, keeping, and knowing. I'm part of that world, but part of it is why you're trying to make a policy argument that results in investments. And if you want to invest in arts, community-based art making practices, sometimes you got to come up with words. Creative place knowing came to me from my indigenous urban planners from the Southwest, who are very mindful of sacred sites. And they never have felt, they've always known place because of the worldview that says there are sacred sites. Now, who says that when you're driving down a street and you see where there's a memorial around some accident, either a traffic accident or a bicycle accident, all of a sudden there's an altar there. It becomes a sacred site. And that's an act of place knowing. It's all very complicated. The role of universities, to me, is it needs to be, and UC Berkeley was part of our exchange program, was really to be about generating knowledges and how can you generate knowledges that are really appropriate for our times. I mean, they also, anyway, I'm not an academic. I can go off. I'll stop there.
Right on. Cece?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question, but there are, I think, some simple steps that can be taken in terms of academia mixing in with just the folks on the ground in the community. I mean, and maybe I can just speak a little bit of my own experience. I mean, as I myself, as an Indigenous woman immigrant here now living in California, I think there's this balancing act that we have to constantly do all the time of just like, how do we adapt and learn different and new ways, but also hold on to our cultures and tradition of who makes us us, and I find that kind of very similar in being in different institutions. I mean, I've definitely have worked hard and also been privileged to be able to be in college and graduated college. And now I'm also part of an institution, part of San Francisco Arts Commission. And it's this constantly like wearing two different hats at all the times. And I think one thing that the universities and a lot of our folks are doing who have been able to get in there are also just really redefining what knowledge is. Like who is sharing what knowledge and what is deemed kind of, what is deemed like successful or worth learning, or however way that is defined. I mean, and how important that is, because I grew up with a family of folks who didn't read or write, and knowing how important it is to document things is actually what sometimes becomes what's history, and knowing and acknowledging that. I think that's where kind of the work is for a lot of this different institution who's trying to do equity work, is acknowledging that there's a lot of different truth, there's a lot of different knowledge, and who is able to share, those knowledge and their stories and what is deemed valuable is very, very important to acknowledge. Like, we are changing languages to fit into academic settings. What does that say to like the language that we've already used and that our people understand? Like, is that not as relevant? Is that not as important? Who's making those decisions on what's valuable? And I think it's an ongoing conversation that needs to be had in all institutions, and even within our own little groups, in our own little communities. It's like, what, because though we have our traditions, know that it evolves and changes, I think same things goes for knowledge and education. What are some of those old, sacred knowledge traditions that we need to hold, that we need to keep and hold to and remember? But what are things that we need to adapt in order for us to be part of this conversations?
Well, we're going to have to let it lie right there. I apologize, Megan and Chico. Just we'll imagine what you could have said or might have said. Cece, thank you. Megan, thank you. Roberto, thank you. Chico, thank you for all of the insights and time and energy. And Catherine, the final wrap up belongs to you. And Juliet, of course, thank you. And thanks to the California Humanities. Also, I'm shouting out Gina, who works with Catherine, who did a phenomenal job on helping produce this. Catherine.
Well, you just said everything I was going to say. I wanted to thank everybody for this really phenomenal conversation. I really appreciate your time and effort. And I wanted to thank California Humanities again for making all of this possible. This is the end of the sort of first iteration of this series, this kind of series of conversations. And I'm not exactly sure what the second iteration is going to look like, but please stay tuned because there will definitely be more to come. And I'll be reaching out to all of you again. And I forgot to mention that there you'll be receiving a survey. It might be popping up already in your emails, or I'm not quite sure how this works, but you'll be getting a survey from Gina to fill out, which we'd appreciate if you did. And please let your friends and colleagues know that they can watch a recording of this, which will be on our website sometime next week. And that is dhi.ucdavis.edu. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Juliette, for starting this whole thing several years ago. All of this really grew out of that. So thank you.
And next discussion will be on June 2nd with SPUR, the urban agency from the San Francisco Bay Area, and the Paris urban agency. So we will have real estate developers talking about how to engage with communities and arts communities.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Good evening.